That's a very good question, because there is indeed a lot of noise and it's a constant distraction and it takes a certain direction depending on what you read. So since I have spent 30 years working on China and the last 10 focused on Latin America, that's my angle, and it's something that I find incredibly useful to get away from the dominant news cycle and try and analyze something where an emerging economy that is obviously very important, the Chinese one, inserts itself year by year more and more in a region that also has a strong impact from the United States directly. And there is a clash of interests of some sort, but China is approaching it in a very deliberate way. And this is something that is helpful to calmly analyze and look at what China's purporting to do, what it's expressing, how it's interacting, and taking a little bit of the sort of daily news and the US angle out of the equation to understand it better. I focus specifically on leadership speeches, Chinese foreign policy, expressions of Chinese foreign policy. So that's something that is directed at a specific audience. It's obviously very well thought through. It's pretty coherent when it comes to China. They have an ability to have a coherent message, but it varies from country to country and from situation to situation and has evolved over time. So that's something that I look at and also try to keep on top of the news in the main economies of Latin America to try and see how that plays out. Many of the speeches I look at are indeed what the Chinese like to call 重要讲话, which are important pronouncements of the senior leaders, especially Xi Jinping in the last few years. But I often compare that to what Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and other leaders said over the last 30 years. So we get a feeling for how that is interpreted, how that bears out over the following years. And I think that from my reading, the priorities that Xi Jinping and other senior leaders lay out when they are on state visits or when there are agreements made between countries in the region that I'm studying and China, those tend to be picked up again and again. Those are the focus, and they are pretty good predictions. They allow pretty good predictions of what is going to go on over the next few years. Both the news analysis and predominant academic analysis tends to focus on numbers, on economics, basically. And this is something I try to move away from, partly because I'm not an economist, and partly because I believe it only tells a very small part of the story and is often misleading. One example is the current crisis in Venezuela, where China obviously plays an important role, but here the angle, especially in the United States, news and scholarly analysis tends to be how does this play out for the United States, and not so much how can China be a constructive player in that crisis and actually in many other crises that are typical of many Latin American countries. During all this analysis, I try to bear in mind that China only really started making significant inroads in Latin America in the early 2000s. And they brought out policy papers and they brought out strategies. So this is still fairly early days. China is a growing presence in Latin America, but in most countries it's still a very minor investor compared to most European nations, the United States and Canada. However, at the same time, we're seeing how China and the United States are increasingly in competition or in perceived competition, not only directly, but also in third regions such as Latin America.